What if you knew that the evolution of the human species is accelerating right now, and that you have a vital role to play? And what if you learned how to create a big, bright, beautiful, sexy, abundant life and heal the world, all in the same motion? This is the Evolutionary, accelerating personal evolution and inciting global transformation to propel us into the age of miracles. All right. Hello and welcome to the seminal episode of The Evolutionary. My name is David Knox and I will be your host for the foreseeable future. And this is a special episode for many reasons. Of course, it's special because it's the first. It's my podcasting virginity and I'm losing it quite publicly. But it also represents that proverbial first step in the journey of 1,000 miles. So I'm really excited. But additionally, as I sat down to consider what I would say, I realized that this podcast would never have happened without my friends and my family, who have loved and supported me through the years. So I'm dedicating this episode to all of the amazing people in my life, whether it was with your love and support, or just by sharing your energy with me, or by listening and allowing me the privilege of listening to you. So thank you so much to all of you. This episode is for you. Okay, let's get to it. So here's what we're going to do today. As I alluded to earlier, this podcast is actually based on a book by the same name. And this feels a little bit like showing up to class without my homework because the book's not done yet. But I wanted to create the opportunity to start sharing content and generating dialogue prior to the completion of the book. So I just decided to get it going right now. Also, some of the research that I'm doing for the book involves interviewing some awesome people who have insights into various aspects of the evolutionary. So I thought it'd be cool to just share some of that raw data with you, air those interviews. So that's how we're going to do it. Most of the episodes will feature guests who have some really amazing stuff to share with us, but some, like today, will be Solocasts, where I share with you the bones of the book and set the stage for the rest of the season. Okay, so since it's just friends and family here, I just want to share with you briefly how this thing started to crystallize for me. So I'm sitting there a couple of years ago, and I'm deep in my 40s, and my life is great. My love life is great. I have great family and friends. My social life is great. My health is great. Great home, great job. Are you getting the picture here? It's effing great. But I'm still struggling with a couple of things. So most of you know that I'm a fairly seasoned manifester. I've been working for decades at this idea of utilizing my thoughts and my feelings to attract favorable circumstances to me, Most people know it as the law of attraction, although I don't prefer actually thinking of it as that, because to me it's more like cultivating a relationship with the universal mind or spirit or God or whatever you want to call it. And we'll talk specifically about that concept later this season, but most people are familiar with the law of attraction, so we'll just use that terminology for now. Anyway, I was stuck on a couple of things, and as it turns out, everybody gets hung up on these things eventually, and in fact, most people are stuck on them in some way right now as we speak. So let's take those two things one at a time. The first is this. There seems to be some fine print in the law of attraction. There seems to be a secret to the secret, meaning that some of the stuff that we try to manifest shows up quickly and easily, and other stuff won't show up at all, no matter how much gratitude and visualization we throw at them. And this is everyone's experience. It's just hit and miss. And I know there's a lot of people out there, even some beginner hacks who watched The Secret like once, who would say, no, the law of attraction always works perfectly every time, meaning that if the thing I was asking for wasn't given, I must be doing something wrong. And yeah, I get that. Technically, that might be the case. But from the perspective of our experience as the first person manifester, it is hit and miss. We feel like we're doing the exact same thing, but the results are different sometimes. There's some missing variable that's escaping our notice. Okay, side note before we go on. So this manifestation culture that has grown up around this has created this weird and not so subtle guilt over failing to manifest something. Because we must be doing something wrong when stuff doesn't show up, which leads us back into the proverbial box because we become nervous about asking for something big from the universe because what if we don't get it? We must be fucking it up somehow. Then we feel like a failure, and then we start to play it safe in our manifestation practices. And there we are, back in the mediocrity of the half-lived life, which is what we were trying to break out of in the first place. This is, of course, completely ridiculous, but that's how it plays out. And we all know it's completely ridiculous, but it's tough to verbalize why it's ridiculous. It's conceptually slippery, So anyway, I will explain why it's ridiculous later, but let's get back on topic. So where were we? Right, there seems to be a secret to the secret, some fine print to the law of attraction. And if we knew what it was, we'd be able to manifest our desires more quickly and consistently. And then we'd be doing what looked like real magic. So that was the first thing I was hung up on, the secret to the secret. And before we look at the second thing I was hung up on, I just want to intimate to you briefly what it was that I was failing to manifest that had me in this quandary in the first place. So as mentioned, things were pretty good in my life. However, I was trapped in the matrix, folks. I was working a corporate job in the tech sector, working for a publicly traded company. So ultimately, I was spending half of my waking life, so many of my precious hours, and so much of my precious energy and creativity creating shareholder value for the 1%. I mean, it just boils down to that. And yeah, I tried to frame it up in a positive light, that I was making a difference for the people who I serve in my job, making them more successful in their careers and therefore making their lives better. And that justification held up for about 20 years, but ultimately it was a hollow artifice and I knew it the whole time. So for the last several years of my career in tech, I kept trying to manifest circumstances that would move me in a different direction. I wanted to shift my career into one where I got to talk to people who care about things that actually matter. I wanted to write books and give talks, but I lacked a lot. I had no skills for writing beyond the ability to compose a professional email. And at the time, I was a mediocre public speaker at best, and I didn't have the cash to sustain me through any type of transition period. And I didn't have any confidence to put myself out there. So basically, I just had myself steeped in lack. So I concocted all sorts of manifestation requests to move me in the right direction, but none of them ever materialized. Sometimes I thought that this was a sign from the universe to just stay in my comfy corporate job and live out my life plugged into the matrix. Give me the blue pill. Then sometime in 2018, I had an insight that changed everything for me. I shifted my focus. I changed the nature of the question that I was asking. And within a year, I had a plan to step out of the corporate grind into what I'm doing now. And I was absolutely amazed at how beautifully, miraculously, all of the outside circumstances were orchestrated for me. And we could talk for days about this gritty yet miraculous year of transformation. And some of those details will come out as the season unfolds. But honestly, this podcast isn't about me. It's about an idea. So I want to get back to the two things that were originally confounding me that ultimately led to this idea. Okay, so the first thing was, what the F is the secret to the secret? And the second thing has to do with the state of humanity and by extension, the world. And what I mean by that is, what the fuck is going on? It's like a fire in a madhouse out there. Like there's COVID-19, but even beyond that, all of our systems are failing. Political, economic, religious, you name it. And they're failing to end human suffering. And they're failing to bring us into harmony with our environment and with each other. And with the planet herself so deeply injured from our behavior, it brings home the fact that our big, bright, beautiful individual lives won't be worth anything to anyone if we don't have a place to live them out. Right? Because we're not talking about having a planet for our grandchildren anymore. We're talking about having a place to live out our own lives. So there's a sense of urgency for sure, but what can each of us do? Well, there's lots of little answers out there. Ride your bike, stop eating animals, have more sex, eliminate packaging materials, get a solar panel, engage in nonviolent activism, vote, be kind, lots of stuff, and it's all really good stuff. But even in aggregate, they don't seem to cut the mustard unless absolutely everyone did them all the time. Also, let's talk about time and energy. I don't know about you, but I got a lot on my plate because trying to create the life that we desire while trying to pay the bills and stay healthy and maintain good relationships in our lives, etc., this is about all we can handle. So even if we all weren't totally consumed with our individual lives and we had some time and attention to devote to healing the world, where would we even start? Right? Think about this. If we made a punch list of all the things that we need to address to heal our world, it would be insurmountable. Even if we took any one of the, say, top 100 biggest problems on that list, it would be insurmountable. The problem of how to heal humanity and the planet is too big to have to fight for every little advancement on every single front. That would be like spooning out the ocean. It's never going to happen if we have to plan out and execute all of the activism we think it would take to make all of the changes to heal our world, especially within our broken systems. I mean, activism is vital, but we need a deeper shift, and we need to invoke higher, faster energies. And so this is the second thing that was troubling me. What can I do, just me, to start healing the world in a way that will actually have impact? And this is when the insight was given, or perhaps the observation was made. And I'd love at this point to tell you a story about a being from the middle star in Orion's belt who contacted me to give me the good word. But it was just a quiet, unremarkable moment of contemplation. And this simple idea compressed from so many different directions. And so much of what I've been studying and practicing in science and philosophy and spirituality just fell together into this beautiful mosaic, fell into perfect resonance, and it was simple. And I realized in that moment that the action that one would take to increase their ability to manifest that rad life that they desire, remember the secret to the secret, and the action one would take to create a big contribution toward healing the world is the same action. And since then, this realization has not only profoundly transformed my life, but it's simultaneously been blossoming out into this model of understanding that I call the evolutionary. So what is this action that addresses the creation of our rad life and heals the world at the same time? Well, if you bothered to read the title of the show, you'll probably guess that it has something to do with our evolution. But instead of dropping it all onto your plate in one chunk, I think it'll be easier to digest if we start with the secret of the secret, and then I'll tie it back into healing the world in one of our upcoming Solocasts. But right now, I just want to share with you a thought about healing the world real quick, and then we'll get back to the secret to the secret. So we've heard a lot about healing the world through the evolution of the human species, and specifically about elevating our collective consciousness. When I hear this, immediately questions come up. Like, how does that even work? Sometimes I hear leaders talking about what we all must do, in which case they immediately lose my interest, because one thing for sure is that we all are not going to do anything the same. There's billions of us and we all have free will. So if the model is that we all have to do something the same, then we're fucked. I mean, we're doomed. But anyway, I'm pretty sure it's not like that. So then, is it like a democracy where we need 51% of the 7.8 billion people on this earth to evolve in some certain way? That doesn't seem very doable either. So then is it like more like a shareholder vote where some people get more votes than others based on some criteria? Well, that might be a little bit more useful model, but it still leaves a lot to be desired and certainly doesn't inspire much hope. But then some people like George Lakey talk about the fact that there seems to be historically a threshold of about 10% of the population elevating their awareness, and that causing the big shift. Other people say 7% is the number. Recently, I heard Dr. Stephen Greer talking about 1% as the threshold for raising up the collective. Now, this sounds more doable, but just maybe it's more like a question of the quality and quantity of energy in the system. And each of us can bring as much as we're capable of bringing. Now, that might be a useful thought, and we'll definitely explore that in later episodes. But then there are more questions arise, like what constitutes being one who is counted in that 1%? And if we're talking about consciousness, it's always discussed as though it's this somewhat static binary determination. Meaning, I guess, that once we reach a certain level of consciousness, that we suddenly are in the 1%, like it's flipping a switch or something. But that doesn't make sense, because consciousness isn't something that you can measure with a single metric like a thermometer, which is how a lot of people think of it, somewhat slow to move and simple to ascertain. But if we think about it, consciousness could have a million aspects to it. And it's changing all of the time for each of us, even throughout our day. So when we get into this topic of what each of us can do to heal the world, I'm going to discuss a way to understand the dynamics at play that shows us how and why the individual can have a dynamic impact on the evolution of the collective at this special time in history. That's going to be a really fun discussion and hopefully illuminating. So come back and join me for that Solocast. It'll be probably a couple down the road. Anyway, let's get back to the secret to the secret. So I'd been studying lots of stuff during this time, and I was particularly into the work of Ervin Laszlo and Nassim Haramein and Rupert Sheldrake and lots of others. But on this particular day, I was trying to get my mind around what it means to live in a holographic fractal universe that is alive and evolutionary. This is a fairly popular idea now, by the way, but it's way outside of what most of us were taught in school. And while it's starting to gain some traction now, it's still pretty far outside of the mainstream thinking in a lot of ways. Anyway, one day I was deep in it, and it can be some pretty heavy stuff for a layperson like myself, and I was starting to feel like my brain was about to pop. So I put it aside and I was thinking about my life, hoping that I was going to find some more relaxed contemplation there, Like that was going to work, because I ran straight into the same old issue that I just mentioned, where I couldn't figure out that missing variable in my manifestation practices. Remember that fine print in the law of attraction? And in that moment, I asked one of the best questions I've ever asked. Because I was thinking, the law of attraction is predicated upon the assumption that the universe is willing to give us whatever we want. And as long as we do all the things correctly, the gratitude and the vortex stuff and the visualizations and so on, that we can have whatever we want. But my inner skeptic stepped in and asked for the first time, why? Why would the universe even care to give us what we want? What's in it for the universe? I had actually never heard a satisfactory answer to this question in decades. But on this day, the answer came straight out at me from several directions. And spoiler alert, the short answer is that it might not care to give us what we want. Now, hold on now. I know that sounds like heresy in the manifestation culture, but just everybody calm down. This is actually going to be a very uplifting story with a happy ending. So let me explain. So we live in a holographic fractal evolutionary universe. This idea has come out of some of the best physics of the last 100 years, but it's also what the spiritual philosophers have been saying for thousands of years, so they're totally on board. So we have some consensus. Cool, but what does that even mean? Well, we'll probably get into this more deeply in future episodes, but I just want to touch on these just a little bit right now. So what does it mean to live in a holographic fractal universe? Well, in a holographic fractal system, all of the information in the system is present at every point, just at a different resolution. So to help us visualize this, the classic example is if you cut a magnet in half, you still have two whole magnets, both complete with a north and a south pole and a 0 point in the middle. The universe is like this. Another example is if you take the lens out of an old projector, hopefully you're old enough to know what an old projector is, and you shine the light through the film, you get a big diffuse image on the screen. But if you hold up a magnifying glass or just some eyeglasses up close to the movie screen, you'll see a teeny but complete image from the film. It doesn't even matter where you move the glasses, you still get a complete picture. Even if you held up a dozen little lenses, you get a dozen teeny but complete pictures. This is called distributed information. All of it is present everywhere. The universe is like this. The universe is a holographic system wherein the information of the whole system is present in every point at all scales, and it holds up mathematically. And I'm not going to go into it now, but I will go into it deeper in the book, the math that is, for anyone who's interested. Okay, so the fractal part means that the equation or the pattern that creates the whole universe and the constant unfoldment of the whole universe also creates everything within the universe at all scales. This is what a fractal is. It's an equation whose answer is then plugged back into itself. Think of like the ancient symbology of the serpent eating its own tail. But fractals make this beautiful, intricate design that repeats at all scales. It's the mathematical expression of as above, so below. And if the universe is like this, that means that we're all created by the same pattern that creates the universe, just at a different scale. So we're literally the whole universe, or at least a holographic fractal representation of it. Okay, so remember, we're trying to determine if, and I guess why, the universe would care to give us what we want. So now that we've established that the universe and each of us are one and the same, with the same information flowing through us and the same patterns creating and sustaining us, let's ask, what is the observable nature of the universe? Well, that's the evolutionary part. It's the observable nature of the universe to evolve into greater degrees of order and complexity and diversity, and I would say arguably beauty. And then if the universe is sentient and conscious, and it has to be if we are a holographic fractal piece of it because we are sentient and conscious, then we can add intentionality to this equation. So it's the nature of the universe to intentionally evolve itself. And if this is what the universe does, then this is what it wants us to do as our first order of business. And this is what it will incite us to do relentlessly and forever. evolve with intention. So this is what I call the primacy of the evolutionary imperative. And no, I'm not claiming with this fancy title that this is the single driving force of the universal mind. Well, actually, it might be, but that's irrelevant. What I am saying is that this is an observation that we can, first of all, verify with our own experience. And then, once verified, we can use it to create anything we desire on this plane. Because the universal mind would actually prefer to give us everything we desire in our life. But we have to get crystal clear on the fact that our evolution gets top priority. Above our happiness, our financial well-being, our health, sometimes even our physical safety, we will be incited to evolve. But we can have all of those things and more, all the happiness, health, wealth, safety, you bet. Just about whatever we truly desire, in fact, as long as we are actively satisfying that primary imperative to evolve. This is the fundamental concept at the heart of alchemy, of magic. This is the key that opens all doors. And by the way, this should start to resonate immediately with our personal experience. So many of the hardships that we've been given might start to make sense in light of this observation. And it can help explain the inconsistencies that we all experience in our manifestation practices. One thing we'll discuss ad nauseum in this series is the mystical, magical feel that life takes on when we release into the flow of the universal mind and we become a willing and active participant in our own evolutionary curriculum and navigation. However, even the staunch materialist can get a lot of utility out of this idea because it has a ton of practical application that's easy to understand. You see, once we understand this evolutionary imperative, we can start to see how it's been playing out in our lives. And then we can make moves to intentionally and rapidly evolve past the need for the same old challenges we keep encountering. Because we're actively looking for the lesson that was built into them, the lesson that we've perhaps been refusing to even acknowledge. One of the most powerful questions I use on myself whenever I run into the same roadblock more than once is, what am I pretending not to know? It's amazing how us human beings can use willful ignorance to avoid having to change anything about ourselves. You see, it requires deep vulnerability to realize that our entire life is our own responsibility, and to admit that we need help, that we need to change, and that we need direction. But once we're able to do so, in the Taoist sense, it's like letting go into the current and letting the flow take us. Because once we recognize the intended lesson, or let's call it an evolutionary opportunity, we create the potential for us to quickly let go of old, tired ways of being and adopt new behaviors and attitudes that serve us better. This part of it is pretty straightforward. For instance, if I'm struggling with money, it may be helpful to focus up on that issue, get on a budget, clean up my debt. If I do so with energy and optimism, that part of my life gets better very rapidly. Okay, notice how I smuggled just a little bit of magic into that last part. It's really the quality and quantity of energy that we act with that really makes the change. It's not the specific actions themselves. Actions are important, but they're not the heart of it. I actually did this with my finances in my early 30s and found that my financial health improved much faster than the math suggested was possible. Because when we truly evolve ourselves, what we're doing is we're making changes to the energetic configuration of our being, right? So there's this idea in physics and spirituality that all matter is actually energy. And we can think of what is sometimes called the causal plane, where energetic configurations are created before dropping down into manifest reality on our plane. This includes the manifestation of matter, but it also includes circumstances and events and thoughts and feelings. Literally everything exists as an energetic configuration before it's made manifest. So here's the cool thing. When we realize that the genesis of every aspect of our life, including our body and our mind, exists primarily as this energetic configuration, we now know where the real work needs to be done. Because when we focus on changing the energy that creates us, our manifesting efficiency goes through the roof. Because we're starting at the root cause level. And while working on that level is deep and sometimes much, much harder, we can circumvent lifetimes of work and get straight to the heart of the matter, as opposed to, say, working on specific behaviors, which are really just symptoms of the underlying energetic issue. If we find the aspect of ourselves that is starting the fires in our life, then we can work on changing that instead of running around putting out fires. For example, I used to be very close to someone who had several dysfunctional relationships in her life. We would talk for hours about strategies for transforming those relationships, getting into the weeds of the dynamics at play and trying to sort it all out. This turned out to be a big game of whack-a-mole. Because after a time, we discovered that the relationship dysfunction was a symptom of a deep and unwanted belief that people suck and they're mean and they're cynical and will eventually hurt you. In her view, everyone was selfish and was really only looking out for themselves. I'm sure you can see where this is going. The even deeper issue was that she was abused as a child, and she was hardwired with some pretty deep self-loathing and taught to expect horrible behavior from people, especially those closest to her. I say hardwired because we're all familiar with that terminology. But what I really mean is that these attributes were set into her energetic configuration. And as you can imagine, this configuration had repercussions throughout every aspect of her life. The point here is that as she's able to modify her configuration, she shortcuts decades of work and will move very quickly into a more joyful existence in every area of her life. She will fix things that she didn't even know were problems. So just a note about terminology here. Energetic configuration is a very generic term, and we'll switch over to talking about morphic or morphogenetic fields in a later episode when we have time to get into that theory and understand how those fields orchestrate the entirety of our being, including acting as the interface between our energies and all of the energies in the universe. This discussion will give us a new and way better understanding of the process of human evolution and allow us to get rid of a bunch of old, tired Darwinian bullshit. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's set all of that on the back burner for now. Right, so we were talking about the relationship between our personal evolution and our ability to manifest our life as we desire it. And we'll come back to this topic in future episodes because that discussion is full of gems that we can use to enrich our lives. And we'll talk more about this amazing gift that it is to be human. Because we are an energetic configuration that is capable of creating other energetic configurations. And I'm not just talking about babies. I'm talking about anything at all. Which means that when we learn to do this well, we're capable of creating worlds. And if we can create worlds, then we can certainly heal this one. More on that later in the season, but before we leave this topic, I want to offer up the single most impactful shift for me that came from this realization. So when we realize that the universe has a primary imperative to evolve, we realize that this life isn't about favorable circumstances at all. It's about who we are. And who we are is always changing. So in other words, life isn't about having, it's about becoming. And many of my spirit head friends like the part about not focusing on having, but then they have some heartburn about this focusing on becoming, because they like to cite some ancient wisdom about simply being, right? So to help us past that, I'd like to pose becoming as the unfoldment of being within a time-bound system. Because we spend all of this time searching for this eternal, unchanging stillness, this bindu point, just being. And this is useful on some level, but the fact is that as humans, we're in a time-bound experience where nothing is ever static, at least not on the physical plane. In fact, many traditions say that we're not static even on the spiritual level. They have us going through this physical human experience in order for our soul to mature in some way through the experience of the limitation and the separateness that come with being human. I think about Buddhism and Hinduism and other Eastern philosophies that say that we're here, in a sense, to become aware, to become one, to become enlightened, even if it takes many lifetimes. So while I get that the ultimate spiritual attainment would be to experience our true unchanging self by becoming one with the universal mind or becoming enlightened, getting there is a process. And here's the thing. For most of us, this is way beyond what would be considered our next step. I mean, think about the axiom that healers and guides of all kinds live by. You have to meet people where they live. So let's just put this little idea of being up on our altar and maybe contemplate it in our daily meditation. But let's also roll up our sleeves and get focused on our own process of becoming. And this leads us as manifestors to change the nature of the requests that we're making in our practice. The things that we ask for in our prayers, the stuff that we visualize in our meditations. So what we want to do is we want to first ask to become and secondarily ask to have. So we ask to become, to be changed, to be made into the person who would naturally attract and sustain the circumstances that we desire. For instance, for years, my request was for the inspiration and time and money to write a book. The problem is I wasn't a writer. And the universal mind was well aware of this fact and knew that the inspiration, time, and money would have been completely wasted on me. It might as well have given a pot of gold to a bunny rabbit. It just makes no sense. So when I changed my request to make me into a man who compulsively writes best-selling books that help people live better lives, at that moment, stuff started happening immediately. After years of inertia, I might add. This small shift in our focus will open up our life in so many ways. And we can still have the circumstances. In fact, we can have them effortlessly and without any of the pain or discord that usually comes as part of the package when we get the stuff that we're not ready for yet. I'll tell you a story about that one next time. But I think I've been rambling for quite a while now, so let me just give you some glimpses into the rest of the season before I sign off. So in the next few Solocasts, we'll get into what it means to be living in the age of miracles. And folks, if you don't already know this, we need to talk more. There are millions of people out there every day having mystical experiences, extra-dimensional contact, spontaneous healings, and that's the tame stuff. This is not a drill, folks, and I am not a sensationalist. I'm frankly a bit over-rational at times. I just happen to be seeing this stuff everywhere I look and meeting these people everywhere I go. Anyway, we'll get into some of that stuff, and we'll also have a Solocast discussion on the concept and new mechanics of evolution. And we'll be going way beyond DNA and natural selection. We'll be talking about the acceleration of the evolution of the human species, and what we're already seeing, by the way. And a little bit about the history of human and biological evolution that we learned about in school. And I know this is going to come as a big surprise to you. Almost everything they taught us in school was wrong in some very fundamental ways. And they're still teaching some of that shit. Anyway. Oh yeah, and we'll also talk about some of the exciting possibilities for the ways in which humans might evolve in the very near future. Following that, we'll get into the healing of humanity and the planet. We'll talk about the special time in which we live and the factors that give us the potential to make a massive impact on the evolution of the species with a very, very few people. We'll talk about that, and then we'll examine the mechanics involved so that anyone can leverage them. By the way, this whole first section where we're talking about the secret to the secret and healing the world, this is called the Evolutionary Framework, and it's section 1 of the book. And of course, no model of understanding would be of much use without a how-to section. So the second section is called the Evolutionary Dynamic. This is the how-to section. This is where we focus on the practical actions that arise from the discussions that we're having now. We'll identify activities that get us out of the gates quickly and set us up for maintaining long-term momentum so that we can keep evolving ourselves throughout the arc of our life. And one of the main things that we'll be doing is learning how to cultivate an open and active dialogue with the universal mind. Okay, guys, so I think I've loaded this suitcase full enough. So full, in fact, that we'll be unpacking it for months. But in between the Solocasts, I'll be interviewing some awesome people who are smarter than me, which will be fun for everyone. And I'll be shooting for a ratio of about 1 Solocast to 4 or 5 interviews. Shoot for that for now. So please come back and join me. And please subscribe, rate and review. And above all, find your path. And you'll know you're on it when you find joy and love and compassion and excitement there. Thank you again for joining me. I'm your host, David Knox, and this has been The Evolutionary. If you'd like to learn more about The Evolutionary, you can check us out at theevolutionary.life. That's right, .life.com is so last season. It's theevolutionary.life. Check it out. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I'll talk to you next time.